Hello, Kumente29 here. With the sequel to Breath of the Wild on the horizon, I thought I'd make a video talking about some ideas I had for things that I'd like to see in the game. This video got its start from a list I made a couple of years ago after I had finished Breath of the Wild for the first time and put up a couple hundred hours into it, of things that I thought would have improved the game. Anything from just small quality of life changes to big parts of the story. I wanted to make a video about that list, but ultimately that video never came to fruition. Fast forward to now, and with us having a teaser trailer and some time to really think about it, I thought, you know what? Why don't I do this, but just tweak it a little bit? So I took that list, refined it, added stuff, took away stuff, changed some things, refined ideas. So this is that list. This video will be divided up into several segments. The first one will be assorted ideas related to the gameplay. The next part will be about minigames. Then a segment about weapons, clothing items, game mechanics, enemies, both new and old, combat, some of the more significant ideas that I came up with, and then story and side quests. So I have to say that before we get into the video proper, I actually had most of this video written and recorded before Age of Calamity was announced. Now, some of my ideas are actually either referenced or incorporated into Age of Calamity, so I actually had to go back and make a few edits to include that and mention Age of Calamity, because it does actually do a few cool things in the gameplay. So I wanted to say that real quick before we actually got into the video, because I actually had to make a few edits. So without further ado, let's get into the video. To start this off with some assorted gameplay ideas that will run the gamut. I want to be able to pet the dogs. You can feed the dogs, which is nice, but I want to pet the dogs. A little thing, but I and a lot of other people just want the option. Please do it, Nintendo. I would like Link to be left-handed. Now, I know they established Link as being right-handed in Breath of the Wild, and unfortunately in the last couple games they've had Link be right-handed. I know Link being left-handed is more of a tradition rather than something that's a necessity, but I do miss it. I liked Link being left-handed. It's just one of those weird things. It's like you grow up playing games with Link being left-handed. It just feels weird for Link to be right-handed. I know why they did it in Skyward Sword, because in Skyward Sword they were using motion controls. And since most people are right-handed, okay, I understand it. He was right-handed for that game, but then he was also right-handed in Breath of the Wild, which kind of bugged me. Now, something that had been recently brought to my attention that I hadn't thought about before is that in the Breath of the Wild sequel teaser trailer that we got, Link's right hand is what gets all messed up with the green glowy stuff. We don't exactly know what that is. But people have speculated, and I can't believe I never actually thought of this before until someone pointed this out to me. But people have speculated that this might actually be used to explain why Link would use his left hand to fight, saying that his right hand is all magic-y, and he may use powers that are equivalent to the runes in Breath of the Wild, but just coming from his magical hand now. That's an interesting idea, and if they actually use that as an explanation to make Link left-handed in a way that makes sense within the context of the story, instead of just swapping it to be that he's left-handed now for no reason, I would be stoked. And I would also be impressed of them coming up with a canonical explanation for why he changed his hands. That's still speculation, just speculation. But I would be really excited if that was the case. I want to be able to sell multiple items at the same time. This is something that didn't really come up until I was replaying the game recently to get reacclimated to make this video. But as I was doing some stuff to grind for rupees, because one of the things I used to do is always that I would cook up stuff, and there's a few recipes that you can figure out that give you a decent amount of rupees, and you can sell all of them, to Beetle and get a lot of rupees and make some money. But I realized that after making like 20 different dishes, I would really like an option when you're selling stuff to just be able to select all the stuff you want to sell and sell it all in one go. Because selling it one at a time, it's not that bad if it's just a couple of items, but when you want to sell like 20 things, oh boy, does that get kind of annoying. It's just a little quality of life change that would really improve that little aspect. And it's something you wouldn't notice a whole lot, but you notice when you really need it. And I just like that in the sequel. I'd like to be able to get some rupees from cutting grass. This is another one of those little Zelda traditions that I really miss. I mean, you can find rupees like under rocks and stuff. It's just not quite the same. Now, I don't expect this to be much, but the occasional green rupee in the grass, that's all I really want. This doesn't really affect anything, and it's not really going to be an effective way to get money, but it's just one of those Zelda traditions. Like, Breath of the Wild proved the point that they can break a ton of Zelda traditions and still make a good game. And I hope, and a lot of my ideas will reflect this, but I hope that with the sequel, they kind of move a little bit back towards the traditions. Not too much. I don't want them to literally just go back to what they did with stuff like Twilight Princess and Ocarina of Time and make another classic Zelda game and completely eschew everything that they came up with in Breath of the Wild. I like Breath of the Wild, but just moving a little things back and adding some traditions back in. I'd like to be able to see the health of my horse. Now, horses will heal when you do stuff like board them and when you send them to the stable and stuff, but if you have your horse out there and it's getting hit, I'd like to be able to make a judgment on how many more hits that they can take and if I need to get them out of danger or not. I'd like an increase in the amount of time that star fragments stay around. Getting star fragments is very frustrating. Now, a star fragment will fall from the sky and you have a short amount of time to get to it. The problem is that they'll often be very far away, and if you're trying to get over to it, you oftentimes don't have enough time because you'll either be running into enemies, you'll be attacked and get knocked over, or if you're on a horse and all of a sudden you get up to a cliff and you need to climb it. And I feel like the star fragments should stay around for longer because star fragments are already pretty rare. Like, you don't really see them all that often. So having them only be around for a short time is really more frustrating than anything. Especially since a lot of the special gear that you can get from like amiibos and stuff requires star fragments to upgrade. It's already rare enough to have a star fragment show up, and it's even rare to be able to get over to it in time. That's one of the things that almost consistently frustrates me. The star fragment will fall and I'll see it and I'll be like, oh, I'll try to run over and get it. And I hardly have ever gotten it. In the over 200 hours I've spent playing Breath of the Wild, I've only ever gotten a couple of star fragments. And I've seen a number of them drop. It's just that I'd rarely get over there in time. So I just would like an increase in time. If not just sticking around until you pick it up or until you leave an area. Like, you go so far away that it would have, basically despawn. Because there's no point in star fragments disappearing after such a short amount of time. I'd like to be able to stick weapons into trees and other wooden stuff like, parts of buildings when you throw them. Like, when you throw a spear and you throw it into a tree, and I just think it'd be a neat little detail if it just got stuck. Because sometimes you do see weapons stuck into, trees and stuff, and arrows. I know, especially when you're going to get the shock arrows in Zora's Domain, and you see several of them stuck in trees. I'd like to be able to do that with weapons. Just a little detail. It wouldn't really affect much of anything. To be able to do things like if you throw a spear at a tree, that it'll stick in it. Or even if you throw a sword or an axe, that you throw it and it sticks in it. This doesn't affect anything. And it's just one of those little things that I thought about when I was playing. Because I threw a spear at a tree expecting it to stick and it didn't. And I was like, I think I'd like it if I could do that. I'd like to be able to get a dog or a wolf and keep it and train it and have it follow you around, kind of like what they do with the Wolf Link amiibo. You know, similar in concept to dog meat from Fallout. But I'd like to be able to get, like, just a wild wolf and be able to get it to follow you around to do stuff. Though this would require you to be able to teleport it with you if you ever teleport to a shrine or to a tower or whatever. Basically to solve the problem that you would run into with horses in Breath of the Wild. Though as long as that issue is solved, it would be great to have that companion with you if you want it, obviously, as an option. But it's just one of those little ideas that I think would actually be kind of cool to have. I'd like to be able to register other animals besides horses. I know they're horse stables, but when you bring up a deer or a bear or one of the skeletal horses, it's like I'd like to be able to register and keep them because I don't know. It's one of I feel like it would spice things up a bit. Okay, I get it for things like the Lord of the Mountain. Like, okay, you kind of have like a Ghibli deity here, so it's like maybe you might not be able to keep that in the stable, but just one of those other odd animals. I think it would be kind of fun to be able to keep those. More unique NPC encounters than just saving them from random mooks. Like, you have a few different characters that you'll see across Hyrule, and like the sisters that are looking for truffles, or those two people who are doing treasure hunting and stuff. When you first run into them, it's like, oh, cool, I'm saving these random people. But then you run into them again and again, and it's the same thing over and over. So oftentimes you'll run into them in the same spot too, and that stuff can feel a little bit repetitive. I'd like more with them. Like, I'd like it if you could also see them in like towns or something. Like, you can talk to them a little bit and maybe learn a little bit more about them. Nothing major, nothing like adding side stories, which would be nice. I'm not going to deny having side stories and side quests with them would be nice, but I'm just saying just to see them in different places so that you interact with them, and they feel a little bit more, I don't know, kind of like people than just getting the same couple of interactions with them. I feel like that would really help to just mix things up a bit so it doesn't feel like all the time they're just all out in the same couple of spots getting attacked by monsters. I like to be able to collect things from all over Hyrule that you can put in your house, kind of like how you can get stuff to put in your room in Persona 5. It feels a little kind of mundane to just buy everything for the inside of your house. And if they're going to bring the house back or let you get a new house or whatever in Breath of the Wild 2, I'd like it if you can like get stuff, like maybe you can get souvenirs from Goron City and Zora's Domain and other places, and kind of to reflect all the places that you've been and stuff that you could collect. Like maybe you can get a little Korok, little wood statue that you can put in the house, and it's little stuff that would kind of make it feel more lived in and more like this reflects stuff that you've done rather than just filling it in when you pay Bolson money. It just feels kind of mundane a little bit, to be honest. And it doesn't really feel all that special when you're buying everything from the same guy. I like to be able to collect stuff, buy souvenirs, and maybe get some stuff from Sidequests that maybe kind of show that you accomplished it. That maybe you can show off in the house saying, hey, I got the trophy from doing the shield surfing, or doing the snowball like roller pin thing. Like maybe if you get a certain record or something in Minigames, that you could get little trophies and it can be displayed in your house so that the house reflects a little bit more of what you've done in the game rather than how much money you spent. They need to make it easier to use horses. Now, in the Breath of the Wild DLC, they added the Ancient Saddle, which allowed you to teleport your horse to you no matter where you were, which was extremely helpful. Not being able to get your horse from wherever you are kind of made horses limited in use. Like, they'd be great for crossing a lot of terrain faster than you could run, but the problem is that you would have to abandon them almost all the time because you want to explore stuff, but then you have to climb on something. You have to get off the horse, or you want to go and battle something, and you get off the horse to do that, or maybe you go into a town and you get off the horse. something functionally similar to the ancient saddle, maybe, some other item that allows you to teleport your horse to you, would be something that you should be able to get relatively early in the game. That way it makes the horses much more functional than they are in Breath of the Wild. Because it was only after I went and got the ancient saddle that I honestly felt like I could keep a horse out instead of constantly having to go to the nearby stable and then call the horse back or, get another horse, which just kind of felt like it broke up a lot of the flow of gameplay when I had to constantly go back and, oh, I need you to go grab my horse, which is on the other side of Hyrule, and then bring him back so that I can ride him. Something like that I would expect to be in the base game because the ancient saddle was very helpful, but it was released after a lot of people had already played the game quite a bit. Rolling. I want rolling back. Now, not just for the sake of nostalgia. Yes, I liked rolling around in older Zelda games, but I figure that with Breath of the Wild, they could add in the somersaulting and actually give it more a gameplay function. You could have it so that it could be used as a defensive option in a fight, where it acts like a dodge, where you can roll out of the way of an attack. And maybe when you're running and you initiate a roll, it can do sort of like an attack that allows you to like break boxes and stuff, or even attack an enemy and stun it. That maybe allow you to do a little bit of damage to an enemy and maybe knock back smaller enemies. I think it would be interesting to actually take the role that has been so iconic to a lot of older Zelda games and then kind of trick it up a bit and evolve it. And I'd also like to just be able to roll around everywhere. I miss that. I'd like to be able to zoom in with the Sheikah Slate when you're moving on a horse. That's something that I kind of want to do because you can do it when you're stopped, but not when you're moving. And sometimes if I'm riding on a way to a waypoint that I set, I'd like to be able to pull up the Sheikah Slate and, confirm where it is specifically so that I can continue heading in that direction. I just feel like that's one of those things that kind of bugs me a lot when I'm playing and I'm riding around on a horse. I'd possibly like the option to be able to see markers that you placed on the map without having to zoom in with the Sheikah Slate. They kind of tie it in when that you can see it through the Sheikah Slate because you place it on the Sheikah Slate. But part of me would like to be able to just kind of see it. Or when I'm moving and I'm trying to get to a destination and I have to constantly keep stopping to pull out the Sheikah Slate. It just feels like it kind of breaks things up and forces me to stop. And continuing with the house, I'd like to be able to have more content and more customization for the house. Now, maybe you might be able to own multiple properties. Maybe you can have different houses and across at different points in Hyrule, and I think that actually might be kind of neat. And maybe you can get another building that's just dedicated to displaying weapons. So you might be able to have a few weapons and shields and bows displayed in your house. And maybe you have this other building where you can put more stuff out that's a little bit more like a museum almost. It allows you to place more weapons there without just being stuck to 3 displays for each type. I'd like to be able to customize the button layout. This feature is available on the Switch generally. It was actually recently added. It doesn't affect the button prompts in the game. So even if you wanted to change up which button was the run or which one was the jump, the game itself would not display those changes. Now, maybe that might change in a future game now that that ability is in the Switch, but I'm a big fan of this option in games, being able to change the button layout. It's always something that I've really enjoyed, and a lot of PC games let you do that just from the get-go. And some console games let you do it. Others will just provide different, a handful of different layouts. But I'd like to be able to just move the buttons around to where I want. This is just a little option that I've always really liked. And sometimes a lot of people just feel like maybe that one button's in just a kind of a weird spot for me. Like the run button for me being X always felt a little weird. I got used to it. Like, it's not like I couldn't play the game, but it felt a little off sometimes when I'm running, especially if you want to run and then jump. It always felt a little cumbersome. I mean, granted, it would take a lot more fine tuning to figure out which ones to switch around. But having that option there for people who want to swap the buttons around, and maybe some people want to swap to the shoulder button being a jump, and maybe the attack would be the Z button or whatever. I don't know. I think allowing that kind of freedom is always a good thing. I'd like it if they brought heart pieces back that can be found in the overworld and even gotten through side quests. Now, I know that they made it so that you get, hearts and stamina expansions through, the spirit orbs and, by turning them into statues. But I miss heart pieces. I like being able to find heart pieces. Now, if they bring back the same, spirit orbs or some kind of equivalent to expand stamina or hearts, maybe they could only put in a handful of these heart containers. But I'd like to have the heart containers because being able to find several of them, either 4 to 5, depending on the game, and then getting a new heart, I've always found that super satisfying. Well, it's good to, it's nice to get a heart container after collecting 4 spirit orbs. It's one of those things to just go back to tradition. I just miss it. I feel like it's one of those things that I really enjoyed in Zelda. And even if it's only there in a more limited capacity, where it's not like you have like a bajillion of them and that's how you fill up, the rest of your heart, containers. Maybe it's just there to add in, the last, handful of hearts. But I miss it. I'd like a full bug collecting side quest, similar to what you did with Agatha and Twilight Princess. They have so many bugs in Breath of the Wild, and I would assume that they're going to add more in the sequel. And while there are some that focus on collecting bugs, like some of them will be like, oh, can you bring this specific type of bug? Can you bring me 10 restless crickets, or worm downer, or something like that. But it's like to have something more expansive of, hey, collect at least one of every single type of bug and show it to whatever bug expert there is. I just think that's something that would be really fun to have. And I'd like to be able to go past the limit of 30 hearts if you eat a meal that has that expands your hearts. Because that's something that kind of bugs me, is that once you reach a certain level, you can't get past the maximum number of hearts. And I know it's the maximum number of hearts, but it does kind of negate that bonus of having a bunch of extra hearts, because those are really helpful when you have fewer hearts. But once you get a bunch of hearts, like stuff that would give you 13 extra hearts almost feels like a waste when you would get the same benefits from just having one bonus heart, because then it would give you a full restore anyways. And I think, just having that, obviously you couldn't be able to stack a whole bunch of that, but just having that ability to go past that, if you really want to prepare and go into something, I think you should be able to do that. Now, for minigames, there's a few ideas I have. First of all, I'd like some full-on competitive snowboarding races. Okay, well, shield surfing races. They have that one lady who's up in the mountains, and you can do the shield surfing down the mountain, and that's cool and all. But I'd like there to be like an actual race. Like they talk about shield surfing being like a thing within Hyrule, and like this is cool. I like that, and I like the mechanic. But I'd like there to be like full on races that you can do against other people. I mean, they already have characters established who like shield surfing and stuff. So it's only the logical step to move forward to actually having races. And much like that, I'd also want proper sand seal races. You have basically a time trial for this one side quest, But again, I'd like actual races. I mean, they established this stuff within the world as like actual sports that people do. But shoot, I'd like to actually race against other people. And maybe this is something that you can have a lot of fun with, competing against other characters and winning some prizes. Maybe this might be a way that you could win money and other special items, along with, opening up shrines or unlocking things. I like the return of the Goron Sumo minigame. I loved that in Twilight Princess. That was so much fun, but you couldn't really do it more than like once. They got the Gorons in the game, and I'd like them to bring back that minigame because that was one of my favorite minigames. Like, not just in the Twilight Princess, but just in the Legend of Zelda games. I love that, and I wish we got more of that. More shooting galleries. We got a horseback one, but I'd like more. They had shooting galleries in like Ocarina of Time, where you stand and you shoot at stuff. I'd like some of that, and then more horseback stuff. And maybe there are different tracks at different parts of Hyrule that you can go to, and you do all these ones where maybe go out to Gerudo Town, and maybe you could do ones on sand seals. There's a whole bunch of different stuff you can do with this. And I always like that stuff, and especially with the way that they handled the aiming with the bow in Breath of the Wild, especially having the little assistance of the motion controls, and especially with the slow motion. I think it would be really fun to add more of that in the game. I want them to bring fishing back. I love fishing. This is just the thing. I love fishing minigames. I love fishing minigames. I cannot tell you how many hours I wasted playing the fishing minigame in Twilight Princess. I love fishing minigames, and especially considering that they have a bunch of different fish, and now collecting fish for recipes and stuff is actually something that's significant and can help you in the gameplay. I think adding more fishing, I think that you can really expand on this in a sequel to Breath of the Wild. Now, to talk about weapons. First of all, I'd like to be able to sell weapons, shields, and bows to merchants. Like, it's frustrating that the only way you can get rid of them is to just drop them. I mean, a lot of times I would like to get rid of some weapons, but sometimes they're kind of nicer weapons. I just don't really care about using them, and I'd like to be able to sell them to make a little bit of money. It just feels kind of weird that like you can't sell any weapons. Like, okay, I get why you can't just go around buying weapons, because the game is focused on exploration and they want you to go run around and explore and collect weapons that you find out in the overworld. Like, okay, I get that, but I'd like to be able to sell weapons. I'd like to be able to store weapons. Now, the idea that I have is sort of having like an item box, like from Resident Evil, where you have different boxes and it's all connected to one storage. So the idea here is that you would probably have like a side quest involving this, where you meet a guy in a town and he has this ancient Sheikah magic box thing, and he has a bunch of them, and then they all connect to each other, and then you have to go and establish different boxes in different parts of the world. Now these wouldn't be super common, as in you're not going to be able to find them at every single stable. This would have to be at major locations like Hateno Village or Zora's Domain, significant major areas. And then you can set them up and you can go to them and you can store a number of items. Maybe you can work to expand it, however much you can hold in there, because it would still have to be limited. With it not being too common, you wouldn't be able to just easily reach them to just grab items and just throw them in storage. But it's there to say, all right, if there's any kind of like special items that you only want to use in certain times, or maybe something you get, especially some of the amiibo weapons, and you want to hold on to them to either save them for a later point or just to store them, having that option so that you don't just carry stuff around, because this is always something that happened to me. I just ended up carrying all this stuff around with me, And some stuff I just either never used or didn't want to use because it's like, oh, I didn't want to break it. And also, you'd probably have one of these boxes in your house so that you had a way to have storage in your house aside from just putting stuff on the walls. Because while that's neat and all, in terms of functionality, it's not really very useful. Unique weapons, and I'm talking like major stuff like the champion's weapons, shouldn't completely break. They should go into an unusable state, and then you can repair them, much like you can in the game in Breath of the Wild anyway. But it always felt really weird to me that, like, you get these weapons from all of Link's friends, all the champions, and then if you break them and just completely destroy them, and then you just get them remade, and it's like, okay, yeah, gameplay wise, functionally wise, it's the same thing, but it's like, oh, I don't want to destroy their stuff. I'd feel really bad about it. I didn't want to use any of it at all. I just stuck all their weapons, in my house and never touched any of them. And it's like, well, I would like to use them, but I never really felt like there was any reason to use them, especially when you could use plenty of other weapons. Now, sure, use stuff like, the Great Eagle Bow would be pretty useful, but it's like, I didn't want to break it and then replace it. I mean, if it went into an unusable state, much like the Master Sword, it's still in your inventory, but then you would have to go and repair it. And much like you do, you need to bring something like, a diamond and give them, money and supplies and stuff in order to fix it. I feel like that would actually encourage more people to actually use that stuff instead of just storing it away and never touching it, which I think kind of defeats the point of having them in the first place. Continuing from that, I'd like to be able to repair any weapon before they break. Now, this is something I've seen debated for and against ever since Breath of the Wild came out, because some people want it, some people think it would break the game. I think it's something that would have to be handled carefully, because you can't just make it super easy to repair anything, because at that point, you could just keep one of a whole bunch of different items and then repair them as much as you want. And you wouldn't be encouraged to go and get different weapons and go find new stuff. So the cost of this should be that, you have maybe different blacksmiths or people who do, repair weapons in different towns. Now, they already have a basis for this, because you have like Dento in Zora's Domain, you have Rohan in Goron City, Buliara in Gerudo Town, Hearth in Rito Village, and you have like Robbie who could handle like the ancient Sheikah weapons, and maybe you'd have someone in Kakariko Village who handled like Sheikah weapons, like the eightfold long sword, stuff like that. Like, you have all these different characters, that are already set up. The basis of this is already set up. In fact, in Age of Calamity, a blacksmith mechanic is actually in the game. So there's already some precedent in regards to that. But in order to balance this, it should cost you money and supplies and stuff in order to do this. Like, significant amount. Like, increasing significantly as the weapons get better. Of course, if you're repairing something as basic as a traveler's sword, it's like, it's not really going to cost all that much, because it's a very, very, very weak sword, especially compared to even a halfway decent sword. But then if you get up to like, royal broadswords, and then that's the part where you're going to have to be like, yeah, you're going to have to be paying more money. The option is there if you have the materials and you have the money, but it's not something that you'd just be doing for any weapon. So for a lot of times, you would simply be better to, when the weapon gets low, on durability, you throw it for that critical hit, and then you go and get a new one. But this is for like weapons that if you really, really wanted to keep, and this is for like stuff that, for more significant weapons that aren't, that wouldn't just go into an unusable state and they would rather break. And I'm fine with stuff like that. You have special weapons or significant weapons. And if you want to put in the effort and time to upkeep those weapons, I think you should be able to do that. It would be easier and more cost efficient to go find those in the overworld. but I'd like the option to be there. I just want to make sure it's also balanced. This would also encourage people to use weapons that are a little bit more rare if they could repair them. That way, it's not like sitting in your inventory never to be touched, which is something that happened. Every time I would find a weapon, I thought, "Ooh, this is kind of neat," and it's like, but I don't want to use it because then if I use it, then I'll lose it. And it's like, okay, well then, what's the point of having it in the first place if you're never going to use it? I just think that there should be something that would encourage people to use some of the more rare weapons. Another idea I had, and this one I'm not totally sure about, is extending the whole weapons breaking but not, exploding into particles but going into an unusable state to every weapon. And when they go into a broken state, they don't disappear, but they are nigh useless. They'll do barely, if any, damage at all. And to repair them, you would have to pay a lot more than you would if you're simply repairing a worn down weapon rather than one that's broken. And you also wouldn't be able to sell it because no one's going to want to buy a broken weapon. And if you do sell it, you'll get a very small amount for it, where it's not even worth it. So for the most part, you're probably just going to want to chuck it and move on and go find more weapons. But let's just say it was a weapon that you really did like, and maybe it was a rare weapon that is harder to come across. So you put in the money and the resources in order to repair it and actually be able to use it again. Again, this is an option that is going to be balanced out by how much resources you're going to have to put into, and it would be even more than it would normally be repairing, because repairing from a broken state would cost a lot more than it would just be normally repairing. And I feel like that would balance it out so the individual player can determine for themselves if they feel it's worth to put in all of those resources to repair this weapon, or if they're just going to chuck it and move on. Again, I'm not 100% on that idea, but I do think it's something to consider as an option when it comes to the weapon system. Now, continuing from that, I had the idea that you could register different weapons with, blacksmiths, and this would go into like a compendium. Much like how the compendium works in the Persona games, where you register a persona and then you can buy that persona back in the Velvet Room. In this case, you would do this with weapons. And maybe you can have different weapons that you've registered reforged for a pretty penny. But again, the option is there, especially if there's a weapon that you registered that's like significantly rare that you're not going to be getting very often. This should be far more expensive than even repairing, simply because, well, this would break the game if it wasn't. I'm a little more iffy on the idea of being able to reforge any weapon that you had registered in the compendium, because while that would be nice, you would definitely have to work again to balance that out in order to make it work. But I do think that maybe it would be cool that if you register every single weapon in the game, and then maybe you'll get a discount with the blacksmiths all across Hyrule. And that would also encourage people to collect at least one of every single weapon in the game, which there's a lot of weapons that people will probably just end up skipping over and not even think about. So that might encourage people to go out and find even lesser weapons, like your average little bokobo, or a traveler's sword, or a rusty claymore, and actually actively go and find them, register them in order to complete the compendium. It would also be a little fun little side game that you would actually have to spend a lot of time doing. And another idea I had with this was that you'd be able to enhance weapons with the blacksmiths. Now, this could boost their attack, durability, how far you can throw it. There's several of these types of buffs on certain weapons in Breath of the Wild anyway. Maybe they can expand on this a little bit more. But of course, this would be something that costs you a lot of money and materials, and the weapons could still break. So you could still put money into a weapon and still lose it. It'd be on you in order to maintain that. But I just thought it would be kind of neat to be able to add to stuff. A lot of this would have to be handled very carefully, because If not, some of these could break elements of the game. There's a lot you can do with this, with the idea of blacksmiths and repairing weapons. And it's something I'd like to see in the sequel, just because there is a lot you could really do with this. And I think this would make it more viable to use more rare weapons instead of encouraging people to hoard those weapons. Because yes, while you could still use them and eventually you'll find another one for it, it's like, okay, well, I keep these elemental weapons with me in case of, they're useful, like carrying a flame sword, because that's actually useful in the cold, and it's also useful for melting giant ice blocks. So I don't want to use it too much, or else it'll break, and then I don't have it anymore. These were just some ideas I had that might be able to help. Now, for clothes, this is something that I actually had a lot of ideas for. There's a lot of different clothing items that you can get in Breath of the Wild. I have no doubt there's going to be a lot more in the Breath of the Wild sequel. But I have a few ideas for this. First of all, I'd like the just casual Sheikah outfit that they have in Kakariko Village, because you can wear the Sheikah warrior outfit, which is cool and all. It also kind of looks like chic. But I'd like that casual outfit, the ones that they all wear. They have the little hats. I was like, that's cool, and that's an outfit that I actually feel was something that should have been in Breath of the Wild. The Yiga clan outfit. Now, this is something I thought would actually be a cool idea, of being able to actually dress up as someone in the Yiga clan. Now, I'd like there to be more stuff with the Yiga clan, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. And this could actually be like part of a side quest where you infiltrate a Yiga clan, hideout, and you dress up as the Yiga clan members in order to sneak in. And maybe you can also get some terrified reactions of people in Kakariko Village or in other places where you where you walk up dressed as a Yiga clan member. The stable uniform. Everyone that's at one of the stables are all wearing those uniforms. And I thought that would actually be kind of cool if you could get one of those. And maybe it's something that would give you like a set bonus that helps you, I don't know, calm horses down faster, or maybe increases the horse's stamina or whatever. Something that helps you with horses. I thought that would actually be, a cool idea. I'd like some type of gear that helps climbing in the rain. Now, this could be something that already exists, like, the rubber, suit. Or it could be something that they bring in. Maybe the Yiga clan outfit helps you, or the Sheikah casual outfit. Whatever. It doesn't particularly matter to me if it's the Zora armor, or whatever. But climbing in the rain does get a little annoying. And while it can be interesting at times where you have to work around stuff, the fact that even to the end of the game, if it rains, you can't climb. Or you have to do a significant workaround, like using Rivali's Gale. That's something that eventually started to grate on me, even as I was replaying the game. And it's like, okay, I'd really like to, get this, especially if you're trying to get a star piece. And it's like, okay, well, now it's on a cliff and it's raining now, and I'm out of Rivali's Gales. So, well, I'm out of luck. I just want something to help with that. I'd like a distinct green tunic for the game that's not the tunic of the wild. Look, I understand why they designed the tunic of the wild like that, because this game is supposed to be taking a lot of inspiration from the older games, particularly the original, and they were designing it more in line with the old Link outfits, but it does not look good on, an older Link. Like, there's a reason why they changed the designs, especially starting in Ocarina of Time, and especially when they, once you got to, like, Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, they had more of a regular fixed design for the older Links and then a design for the younger Links. The Tunic of the Wild, first of all, it looks gaudy. I would always wear the Twilight Princess tunic, because I think that looked really good. And I actually wore that for the final battle with Ganon just because I wanted there to be a green tunic. And the whole champion's tunic is nice. I wish you could dye it green at the very least, but you can't. It just. I understand they wanted to break from traditions. I understand that. But having Link not have a proper green tunic that doesn't look really bad, I found that more than a little frustrating. I would like there to be something that is at least more in style with, the Skyward Sword or the Twilight Princess tunics. I mean, what I ended up doing was I took the Hylian tunic and I dyed that green. And, it also had like some leather armor, strapped to it. I'm like, okay, you could embellish the design a little bit to make it more distinct to Breath of the Wild Link. But I'd like something other than the Tunic of the Wild, because I hate the Tunic of the Wild's design. It's ugly. It does not fit an older Link. It should be something more in line with Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword Link's tunics, because when you put those on, Breath of the Wild Link, they look really good. Please, something more in that style. The Hero's Shade Armor. This was an idea I had. I was just like, it felt like a stroke of brilliance. And I'm not the only person to think this. Someone's actually drawn art of this, and it looks pretty good. I would absolutely love to have the Hero Shade's armor. Just as a callback to Twilight Princess. And maybe you can also get his sword and his shield as like, special rare, weapons that you can get. Just some ideas. Now, I'd also think it'd be cool if you could wear some more stuff that's more in line with like what enemies wear. Like maybe you can get armor that's styled after Darknuts, and if they bring Darknuts back in the next game, or base it off of another, Darknuts, like the Twilight Princess ones or the Wind Waker ones. And maybe Iron Knuckle armor. Maybe something similar to that. Or maybe something that's like the robes that the Wizrobes wear. And maybe that could even give you a boost to like magic as a set bonus. And maybe it gives magical weapons like rods and elemental weapons increased durability, or something along those lines. And another idea is, considering the fact that we have a lot of outfits based off of other Zelda games, I thought, what about stuff from things like Hyrule Warriors? Like, what if you got Hyrule Warrior Link's outfit? What if you got the Hyrule Warriors, like the trainee outfit that he wears? Oh, that would be cool. I mean, what if you got Volga's armor? I liked Volga in that game. So I thought it'd be really cool if you can get stuff like that. Or maybe like the Twilight Princess Rancher outfit that Link has at the beginning of the game is just one of those special bonus. That can be like one of those amiibo bonuses that you can get, is just a little rancher. Or maybe it's one of those like rare items that you can find as part of a side quest in the sequel, and it's like, oh, it's this old rancher, outfit, making clear references to Twilight Princess. So it's just, I think that would actually be cool. And maybe you could have like the postman outfit, and maybe that could give you like a boost to your running speed or something as a set bonus. It's just funny. You can go wild with it. They have a Tingle outfit, for Pete's sake. They're willing to go wild with this. Now, another idea I had is that they could bring back the iron boots and their functionality, but then make them clothes. Now, whether they keep the pants and shoes the same or separate it, I don't think they would separate it, because I think they're already they don't want to complicate things too much. So if you have the iron boots as like special clothes that you can put on and you get the effects of the iron boots, I think that might be a neat way to reincorporate the iron boots. We'd also kind of be moving a little backwards, because they had made iron boots an item that you could just click on and off. And like, especially they did that as an update in Ocarina of Time 3D. And then now you'd have to go back to the menu and turn on and off or swap it to different outfits. But I kind of miss the iron boots and a lot of stuff you could do with that. And if they do something like what I suggested earlier, bringing back the Goron Sumo minigame, which did require the iron boots, maybe they can incorporate the iron boots into other aspects of the games and maybe even into puzzles and stuff. Now, to talk about some ideas for mechanics. First of all, I'd want them to bring back the hookshot, or at least the same kind of functionality. I know they wanted to put the hookshot in Breath of the Wild and they tested it out, but they felt it was kind of game breaking to just be able to zip around anywhere, and it would kind of make a lot of climbing mechanics useless. And it kind of neutered the climbing, and I understand that, which is again why they would need to have to balance it out. But I think if they're going to bring it back as, as a rune, or maybe with Link's magical green arm thing, if that's how they're going to be handling powers, I'd like them to bring it back, but make sure it doesn't break the game. And maybe have it start out not being able to reach too far, and then you can progressively upgrade it. Now, obviously, you wouldn't have anything like the double claw shot like you had in Twilight Princess, because that is that would be way too OP. But having one hook shot ability that you can shoot out to get to some places, and then having it be on a cooldown like the other runes are in the game, I think that could work. I'd like to be able to stack buffs so that, like, if you wear an outfit that boosts your attack and you want to take an elixir that boosts your attack, because you can only go up to a certain level, I'd like to be able to, stack it as much as you can, just because, well, why have all these different ways you can do it if you can't ultimately stack them? I'd like to be able to create ice platforms by shooting ice arrows into the water. The Cryonis rune allows you to create big ice blocks, but you can only create 3 of them at a time. But I'd like to be able to shoot ice arrows into the water and create a platform like you have been able to do in previous games. Like, the Cryonis ability is useful and all, and it doesn't use up any arrows. But I actually noticed this one time when I was basically in this water area and I was fighting some Lizalfos and Wizrobes, and I had created some Cryonis blocks in order to block myself off from getting attacked from the Lizalfos. And I wanted to deal with the Wizrobe, but I wanted to move, but I couldn't move because I had already placed my Cryonis blocks, and I instinctively pulled out an ice arrow and shot it into the water, only for that to not do anything. The idea is that you could create a platform, that it would only last for a short time, where the Cryonis blocks last for much longer until you they're destroyed, or you break them, or you leave. You leave the area. They wouldn't be raised, just be flat, small platforms. It's just a little neat idea that I think would actually be really cool to have. If Korok seeds return, or some equivalent, there needs to be rewards for collecting over the needed amount. To use Korok seeds as an example, there are 900 total seeds in Hyrule, and you only need 441, so you have a whole bunch left over that you don't need to get. And if you do collect them in Breath of the Wild, you don't really get anything special. My idea is that if you go past this amount, you would get something nice for it. Say every, 10, 20 seeds, you get a really nice, Korok, piece of Korok equipment, like a sword that has super high, damage, or a shield that's got super high durability, stuff like that. Just, nice, regular stream of Korok weapons that you can get if you collect over the needed amount of seeds. And for every 1/3 of the remaining seeds that you collect, you get a piece of clothing. And the idea that I had with this was that it looks like kind of like a Kokiri outfit from Ocarina of Time, but it looks like it's got all like covered in moss and leaves and vines. And the set bonus would give a significant increase to any kind of Korok equipment. So all swords, shields, and bows and spears and stuff that you can get that's all Korok's wood weapons get a significant boost in attack and durability, making them far more viable to use in normal gameplay. So that this is your nice reward for collecting all of them, and it's certainly better than Hestu's gift, because that's kind of an insult. It's funny, but it's not really helpful if you went through all of the hard work to collect all 900 seeds. This is just an idea that I had that would give you actual viable rewards for collecting more of the seeds, or hopefully if they do any other Korok equivalent later. That's an idea to have. I'd like some kind of musical mechanic, like with Ocarina of Time, the Wind Waker, or the Goddess Harp. I miss there being some kind of musical element in Breath of the Wild. It just feels like it's something that's kind of missing. I mean, it could just be something like a supplementary mechanic. It doesn't have to be the title of the game, like Ocarina of Time and Wind Waker were. I mean, the Goddess Harp wasn't called, Legend of Zelda, the Goddess Harp. It was Skyward Sword. But it's just something I would like in some way. Maybe it'll give you some extra stuff. I'd like to be able to craft items. Now, I'm not talking about being able to craft, like, actual weapons, but to be able to craft things like arrows. So that if you have, like, flint and wood, and if they add cuckoo feathers as materials, then you could, like, make arrows. Because that's something that I found that I would run out of quite a lot. I'd collect a bunch, and then I would run out quite a bit, because I use arrows a lot. And if you have over a certain amount, the game will cap you on what you can buy. You can't just buy out every single arrow in Hyrule, because then they'll only respawn after you get under a certain amount. So I'd like to be able to craft some stuff. Now, you wouldn't be getting that much flint, and you wouldn't be able to just make hundreds of these all the time, but I do think having the option to be able to craft them as well as buy them. For those who want to use a lot of arrows, then you would have to go out and collect a bunch of materials and then make them yourself instead of just being able to buy them, which would actually work in line with the design philosophy of Breath of the Wild, which was to encourage exploration. Hey, cut down every single tree, collect every single bit of material. If you can, and get feathers from cuckoos. If you want to make arrows, then you have to go and collect a lot of these basic materials. And, I think that would actually be really nice and be very helpful for me, most definitely. Having an upgrade tree for outfits. Now, with the outfits, it's just a linear upgrade. It's just 1 level, then 2 level, and 3 level upgrades. You don't have any specific things that you get to choose. But the idea is that you could choose certain upgrades for outfits. Like you can get a boost to attack or a boost to defense. And then you could enhance either one and mix and match the different pieces of it. Say that you can boot, like maybe you have the shirt boosts your attack, or the legs will boost your defense. You could mix and match to customize, or focus heavier on one or the other that would fit your playstyle a little bit better. And you can buy multiples of most of these outfits. And I think it would be nice if after you collect like a full set or something of a special outfit, that it would be available to buy, and you can customize it in any way you want. If you want to get another one and then customize it a different way, it would be really cool and help with the customization aspect of the outfits. I'd like to be able to make like offensive potions. Like maybe you make a potion that you can throw that's like a fire one, or an ice one, or an electricity one, and it kind of would act like what would happen if you shoot a chew of that respective element. And maybe it requires those elemental chew things or whatever, and you make a potion for it. It would go into your weapons inventory, so that you have to switch to that and use that as a weapon. To balance out how useful this is, it should be able to hit you, and you're giving up the ability to use close quarters combat because you're holding a potion, not a sword or an axe or whatever. More refined stealth mechanics. I love stealth, and I was stoked to see stealth elements actually put into a Zelda game. I really liked it, and I'd like more of it. Definitely plenty of opportunity to do stuff like this. You can even bring back some elements from previous Zelda games that weren't used all that much. For example, in Wind Waker, during that part where you have to sneak around the Forsaken Castle, you can hide in barrels and move around in them. Very similarly to using a cardboard box in the Metal Gear Solid series. But what if you could do that in Breath of the Wild? Maybe you could carry some items or find them in the overworld, and you can like hide under a barrel and sneak around in order to get the drop on people or to sneak by some powerful enemies. Some more elements like that to add on to the ones that are already there would make me a very happy camper. Make updating runes or whatever equivalent the sequel is going to have more significant than just getting a couple of upgrades and then being done. That's something that kind of shocked me when I was playing Breath of the Wild, that when you were upgrading the runes, it's just like, okay, collect all these, pieces and parts to upgrade the runes. All right, click, click. All right, you're done. Okay, that seemed kind of fast. I don't even mind if it's more incremental and then you have to do it over and over again, because I'd like more time with Pura. Like, I felt like she did not fulfill the potential she really had. And the fact that she only upgrades the runes a couple of times and then boom, you're done, you don't really need to speak to her again, was kind of annoying. I'd like to be able to work with other travelers and adventurers that you meet along the way. In Breath of the Wild, you can meet a number of NPCs that were travelers or treasure hunters or scavengers or whatever. And they would talk about doing this stuff. They would talk about how they have gone into, Hyrule Castle, but they just couldn't get too far because it's just too dangerous. Or they talk about how they've, excavated these ruins and they couldn't find anything. Or they talk about how they've fought monsters and stuff. And this is actually really cool, but that's all they really do. They just talk. The most involvement you'll get from them is if they're walking from one point to another and they happen to run into a monster and they start fighting it, and you can fight it with them, but they never really do too much. It's neat to see them actually, pull out a sword or something and start fighting, but it's just never really too much. I think it'd be neat if you could actually work with some of them, whether it be like hiring them, like maybe you hire an adventurer or a mercenary and they can go with you and help you out. And maybe there are different ones that specialize in different weapons. Someone who uses a sword or a claymore or an axe or a bow or a spear. And each of them would have different specializations that will affect combat differently. And I think that would actually be really cool. Or maybe you can go with a treasure hunter and go find some treasure, and they'll have abilities that make it easier to find stuff. Now, I know that idea is treading pretty close to companions and Fallout, and it would definitely require some tweaking and refinement in order to make it work, because with how you move around in Breath of the Wild and teleport to, shrines or towers or whatever, and you're moving all over, having them keep up with you is definitely going to be a bit of a challenge to fix. Maybe if it doesn't go that far, it'd be cool if there were certain side quests where they'll say something like, oh, I want to go defeat this monster, and then you go with them and work with them to fight. Or maybe a treasure hunter wants to find a specific treasure in this ruins, and you go with them and help them out, and they'll help you out. So you can work together with these other NPCs in a way that actually makes it feel like other people in the world are doing stuff, rather than just running into them and them saying, oh yeah, by the way, I travel around and I ran into a guardian or something like that. I just think that would be something neat to add in. I'd like it if there were more areas that required the use of fire to light it up, like caves or dark temples. Breath of the Wild toyed with this idea in a couple of places. Like when you go into Vasradunia and it's pitch black at first, or that one area, I think it's way up into the north of Hyrule, where when you go into that place, it's inexplicably just pitch black and you have to use fire in order to see. Or, there's some of that in the Trials of the Sword. And those parts are neat, but they're few and far between. Even if it's midnight in Hyrule, it's not going to be that dark. You can still see around just fine. I feel like there was a bit of a missed opportunity when it came to actually having a use for the torch, because you can carry a torch around, but there's very few times in the game that you're really going to need it. And when you do, they'll usually just provide a torch for you. Just be sitting right there, and they're like, oh, I need to go light the ancient furnace, here, and then, all right, that's fine, but then they'll just have a torch right there. When you go into the Lost Woods, and there's that one part where the fire and the way the wind is blowing will help point you in the right direction, they'll just provide a torch right there. I feel like if you want to provide a reason to keep a torch around, having a lot more areas like this that are darker, that are actually genuinely dark, not just a little darker, but like actual dark that you need light in order to see. I think this would actually give the torch an actual real use. And seeing some caves in the Breath of the Wild sequel teaser trailer, I think there actually might be some room to work this in. Having maybe if there are caves or maybe if there are temples or whatever that are just dark and you have to use fire in order to find your way around. I liked the parts of the game where it let you do this as it was part of a challenge. I never really felt like there was much of a need to use fire to see stuff. I mean, they could also include like a lantern, like Twilight Princess had, and maybe that's something that you can attach to your belt or something that would be an advantage that would have. Only that would also have to have fuel like Twilight Princess had, and you have a limited supply of that, and you can't just restock whenever. You would have to go and buy it, or find it or whatever. So you would still have to manage that. And with all the focus on exploration in Breath of the Wild, actually putting in that sort of very much fear of the unknown in darker areas, having to manage your light sources on your own without having it literally just handed to you, I think would be rather fun. Now to talk about some ideas with the enemies. First of all, I'd like there to be improved Molduga fights. The Moldugas are interesting at first, and they seem really scary and terrifying until you know how to cheese them. Because if you have any kind of land to stand on, you can just get their attention, stand there, shoot a bomb arrow when they jump up, and then go in and destroy them. And if you have any attack buffs, you could pretty much do this in just one round of it. I'd like it if they improved it so that you couldn't cheese them so easily. Because even when I went back to Breath of the Wild several years out of practice, I was still able to cheese the Molduga. It's really not hard at all if you know what you're doing. I'd like it to still be kind of a challenge, even if you do know what you're doing. Especially when these are giant sandfish monsters. You shouldn't be able to cheese the fights. I'd like them to add new enemies. Now, something I'd really like, and something I fully expect them to do, is to add new enemies. Well, Breath of the Wild does have a decent selection of enemies. More is always better. Now, Breath of the Wild brought back a lot of older enemies, such as Lionels and Hinoxes, which I actually didn't know at first were older enemies that were brought back. I mean, they were heavily reworked and reimagined, but they were still based on older enemies. And I'm like, you know what? Do that with a lot of enemies over the decades worth of history of Zelda games. I'd like to see some more returning enemies like Gorillas, Gibdos, Peahats, Stalfos, Tektites, Vire, Akamon, Arulauder, Geldarm, Armos, Geldman, Dodongo, Poe, Dynalphos, Cursed Bokoblins, Iron Knuckles, Ball and Chain Troopers. Gotta catch 'em all, gotta catch 'em all! Gotta catch 'em all, gotta catch 'em all! And particularly, I'd like to see the return of the Dark Nut. I always loved fighting the Dark Nuts, like in Wind Waker and especially in Twilight Princess. They were one of the most fun enemies to fight in Twilight Princess. And some of these, particularly ones like the Iron Knuckles, Ball and Chain Troopers, and the Dark Nuts, would make for excellent mini-bosses on the same levels of Hinoxes and Lionels. And you could have the Iron Knuckles, Ball and Chain Troopers, and Dark Nuts, and have them each have some kind of different speciality. Like the Ball and Chain Trooper could wield the ball and chain, and it would be interesting if they brought back that weapon from Twilight Princess. That was an interesting, if rather situational, weapon from Twilight Princess. And it would be fun if they brought that back as just another weapon that you can get. Another weapon to the sandbox is always interesting, especially considering that it would be very unique compared to any other weapon in the game. The Iron Knuckles could have, more heavier weapons like hammers and axes. Maybe even they could bring in maces. And the Dark Nuts could each carry a variety of different weapons, like swords and claymores and halberds and bows. And maybe as you get higher up in the tiers, like, you know how they have like the red, blue, black, silver levels in Breath of the Wild, you have different levels of the dark nuts, and maybe each of them carry some different weapons. And as you get to like the higher levels, they carry multiple weapons and they can swap between them. Not just like how in Twilight Princess, after you got the first phase done where they threw the giant sword out and then they used a smaller but more agile sword, or they could on the fly swap between weapons. Like in the middle of a fight, they swap between a broadsword and a claymore and a halberd and a bow, and they can just use all of these on the fly, much like how Link can use multiple different weapons in a fight. It would actually be very interesting as a sort of a reflection of Link's abilities. Like, what if you had a very powerful enemy that can use the same types of weapons and the same variety of weapons as you? And maybe the Darkness could have their own like special little series of weapons, like how the Lynels have special Lynel weapons. And maybe even the Darknuts could also carry like elemental weapons that would add another layer of fighting them. Like maybe they have an ice sword or a fire halberd. That would add so much variety to just the Darknuts. Honestly, it gets me excited just thinking about these ideas. And besides my excitement over talking about Darknuts, seeing a lot of returning enemies would actually be really cool. A lot of them would fit fine because we've seen them in 3D games. And a lot of the older ones that haven't appeared outside of the older games, it would be really cool to see them reimagined for a 3D Zelda. So, if they have dungeons and they can be tackled in any order, which even if they do bring back traditional dungeons, I do expect that they'll let you tackle them in any order to allow as much freedom as possible. I'd like it if the bosses scaled up the more dungeons you did. The biggest problem with the Blight Ganons as bosses is that they don't scale up after you beat one. The first one you fight is generally going to be relatively early on, so it's going to be a pretty tough fight. But after you get better equipment, they end up becoming kind of a joke. By the time I completed the last Divine Beast, it was a cakewalk to beat the Blight. It just wasn't a challenge. In terms of the structure and design of the fight, it was good. It was just, you get so much stronger to them because they are designed that you can tackle them in any order. I'd like it if the bosses scaled up so that the first one you fight is going to be a lot weaker than the last one you fight. So even as you get stronger and stronger with better equipment and better experience, you shouldn't be able to just cheese through any of the boss fights. I'd like there to be more variety to the Yiga clan encounters. The first time you run into a random traveler and you start talking to them and then they all of a sudden reveal themselves to be a part of the Yiga clan and try to kill you, it's shocking. But when that same trick is done dozens and dozens of times, it very much loses its effect. And similarly, with them just teleporting in to attack you, it's interesting for the first couple times, but then it just gets really redundant. Even when they bring in the big guys with the wind cleavers, which, when it does happen, is a nice mix-up, but even that becomes pretty routine really fast. A little more variety with this, especially since it becomes extremely easy to spot. Like, if you don't see a name, like if that traveler doesn't have a name, you know it's Yiga Clan. Every traveler in the game has a name. So the ones that are just traveler, you know it's Yiga Clan. So I'd like it if they added more variety, different types of weapons that they use to fight. Like I suggested with the bosses, the more you play through the game, the more that the Yiga Clan assassins get buffed up, so that even as you get to the end of the game, there's still a threat, because they ultimately just end up becoming a nuisance very quickly in Breath of the Wild. The second you have halfway decent weapons, they just become very easy. Since it looks like we'll be getting a zombie Ganondorf, I'd like there to be more stages to the fight than there were in Breath of the Wild. And I'd like it to be a bit harder. Now, maybe this is just me being a little bit biased, because by the time I got to Ganon, I was so well equipped that I didn't even bother using my strongest weapons against him. Now, maybe it's like something I suggested with the bosses, that maybe the more you do, the more powerful Ganondorf becomes. Like, maybe it's a trade-off, where, sure, you get better prepared, but then Ganondorf will be a harder fight. Or maybe they give him a fixed level of a fight, but he's just really hard. And I definitely like there to be more phases to the fight, especially since it looks like we're actually going to be having a body for Ganondorf to fight. I'd like it if we got another duel, like we got with him versus Link in Twilight Princess. Fighting numerous phases against Ganondorf in Twilight Princess, which tested a lot of the skills that you would have gained over the course of the game. From the one-on-one fighting, to the using the wolf Link, to the horseback riding. Considering all the different things that you do in Breath of the Wild, I would love it if the fight with Ganondorf did genuinely test all the various different skills. And it's not just that one fight and then, you run around in effectively a glorified cutscene, just hitting the weak spots for massive damage. I mean, it looks cool and all, and I don't want them to shy away from adding a cinematic flair to it, especially since it is the final fight against Ganondorf. But I definitely like it to be a challenge, even if you manage to do something like weaken him like you could do with the Divine Beasts for the fight in Breath of the Wild. And of course, I also want them to include a part where you have to trade volleys with Ganondorf.
It's a tradition.
Now, for the harder difficulties, I would love it if enemies could get buffs, like from eating food and stuff, and maybe even heal from eating that food, much like how you can. And maybe they can buff up their attacks and their defense and their speed, and it would really make them a lot harder to deal with. Now, this could just be something in Master Mode, or maybe you could have even multiple different levels of variations, or maybe you can even have customizable difficulty. I'm definitely a big fan of customizable difficulty, but this is just an idea I think would actually really add to fighting the enemies on harder modes. Now for combat, I have a number of ideas. First of all, I'd like to be able to move while just doing regular slashes. This is less for combat and more for functionality, for cutting grass, because having to stop completely when you're slashing makes cutting grass a little more tedious than it should be. In previous games, you've been able to run around just doing basic slashes, so I'd like to be able to do that. I mean, sure, yeah, it could also be used in combat, but this is mostly just for cutting grass. I like to be able to use the shield parry move in order to push back an enemy or stun them. This was something that was done in Twilight Princess with the shield bash, and certain shields in Breath of the Wild will damage an enemy when you swing it. But I'd like to be able to at least push them back, at least smaller enemies with it, or to help with stunning some enemies for something that I'm going to talk about in just a minute. I'd like to be able to use Urbosa's Fury without having a weapon equipped, because you need a weapon equipped in order to do the charge attack. When Link first gets Urbosa's Fury, he does this big overdramatic snap, and it looks so cool. I'd like to be able to actually do that in the game. Like if you don't have a weapon and you hold down the attack button and then it does the Urbosa's Fury charge. If we're going to have Urbosa's Fury back in this game, I'd like to be able to use it without needing a weapon equipped. I'd like them to fix the issue when it comes to fighting enemies on different elevations with things like the wind gust from the Korok leaf or the wind cleaver's little wind slash. It has difficulty hitting enemies that aren't directly in front of you, and I think that's just a little something that, if that was fixed, would really improve stuff, because sometimes you want to hit those enemies, but if they're on a hill and they're a little lower down, it just won't hit them, and it can get really annoying in a fight. I'd like Link to have more complex movesets when it comes to weapons. When it comes to swords, I'd like the combat to feel a little bit more like Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. where you can at least affect some of the combos that you do. That way it doesn't feel as basic. The combat in Breath of the Wild isn't horrible, but it does feel a little bit more limiting compared to when you play Wind Waker or Twilight Princess. Especially Twilight Princess. And if they added a little bit more elaborate combos like you had in Twilight Princess and Wind Waker, it would definitely give the combat a little bit more flair than just the static 3-hit combo. Like, those basic combos can still exist if you just stand still and then press the attack button multiple times. But having more combos would really help mix it up and make the gameplay feel a little bit more interesting when you're using a sword. And especially, I would like them to bring back stabbing with a sword. That's something that I really, really do miss. And along with that, I'd like each of the weapons to have more complex moves. Like, a lot of them do follow the same basic attack patterns, and for something like spears, all you can do is slash. Some of them end up feeling extremely limited. I barely use spears just because of how limited they are to use. For example, with a spear, if you could swing a spear and hit multiple enemies, then it wouldn't do as much damage as like a claymore or a sword, but it would have a much wider range. That's a much more interesting trade-off, and it might actually make spears feel a little bit more useful. And maybe you can even charge and spin around with a spear, as well as doing the whole multiple stabby attack. You know, it can be used as like a crowd clearing move. That would definitely give spears a lot more use. And these are just a couple of ideas, but if you really made each of the different types of weapons have more uses than just relatively simple ones, then I think that would definitely encourage the players to use more than just the swords. Because I find myself, no matter how many times I play Breath of the Wild, end up stockpiling royal broadswords just for the fact that the swords are just some of the best weapons. Claymores come in a nice second because they can do a lot of damage. But other than that, I just don't feel like the game encourages using other weapons as much. At least not unless you're in a pinch and you just happen to pick up a Bokoblin spear and use that for a little bit until it breaks. Now, the basic idea of this already exists in Breath of the Wild. Now, it's not very common, but certain weapons do actually have differences in their movesets. For example, the Eightfold Longsword, when you do the charge for it, it doesn't do a spin. What it does is Link pulls it back at his waist, and then he does a strike, which makes sense for the type of weapon that it is. It's basically just a big katana. But that's interesting. What if we did that with more types of weapons? And what if we made each of them feel a little bit more distinct than just having a handful of movesets for all the different types of weapons? And I'd like a little bit more differentiation between different weapons of the same category. Like, for example, bringing back the idea of being able to swing a spear. That if you had, say, a halberd compared to just a regular spear, that the halberd could do more damage swinging than the regular spear would. The big idea I have with this is actually to bring back abilities like the hidden skills from Twilight Princess, and then have moves like this available for all the different types of weapons. Now, this could involve having, different masters that focus on different types of weapons, and then you do side quests for them to unlock these different types of moves. And interestingly enough, Age of Calamity actually has little side stories that involve Link training with masters. Usually it'll give you some more combos. But it's interesting to see that this idea was actually introduced in Age of Calamity, where Link can actually train with masters. This could very easily translate into the Breath of the Wild sequel with my ideas. Like with Twilight Princess, you had like the ending blow and the back slice, the helm splitter, the mortal draw, all stuff like that. And it'd be cool if you could learn stuff like that and unlock these different moves over the course of the game. It would, one, make combat more interesting, and two, it would definitely give you a greater sense of progression as you play the game. that over the course of the game, you learn these special abilities. So by the time you get to the end of the game, you have all these different extra moves that definitely make, combat a lot more complex. And especially with things like the backslice, like that also added like an extra roll that you could do that you could use to get around behind an opponent. That would actually be so handy, even if you don't actually use it for the backslice. But having those extra mobility options along with these extra moves would definitely make the combat feel a lot more interesting. And like I mentioned, it would also be good to have stuff like this for all the different types of weapons. Like for any kind of like spear, maybe you could learn to swing it around like the bokoblins do on ground and on horses, and use that as a consistent crowd clearing move, not just as a charged attack, but as a continual thing that you can do while you're moving around. And maybe that would, use up stamina as you're doing it. And maybe there's a mobility option that you can get with a spear. Like maybe instead of just jumping side to side and flipping backwards, you effectively use the spear to pole vault and increase your movement. That way it would genuinely change up how you're playing. And it would even give use to certain weapons that are very simple, like the pitchfork, which might not do a whole lot of damage, but if you can use them for extra mobility to move around, that incentivizes even holding on to something as simple as a pitchfork or a broom that you can use to move around a little bit better. And maybe for weapons like claymores, that you can learn an ability that lets you block an attack with the claymore at the expense of a chunk of its durability. So while that you're normally not carrying a shield, you can defend yourself, but it comes at a cost. And again, those are just a handful of ideas. But adding in extra stuff like that with the combat would really make the combat feel a lot more complex. Bringing back my idea about the Dark Nuts and them having more complex fights. Having these different abilities would really make for more interesting fights if you have a lot more options and your opponents have a lot more options. Now, for some bigger ideas, first of all, I'd like to have more traditional dungeons back. Like the Divine Beasts were fine and all, they were fun to play, but they were kind of on the shorter side, and they were all just kind of samey in terms of how they looked. Now, I don't want the shrines to go away. I like the shrines, and I think they were nice little bite-sized ways to mix things up a little bit, so it's not just like, everything is concentrated in the dungeons, and then the overworld is its own thing. The shrines were really fun, and the Divine Beasts were cool and all, and they each had unique gimmicks with them, which worked really well. But I really miss the traditional dungeons that we had in previous Zelda games. I think the best balance would be to have a selection of traditional dungeons with shrines added onto that. Now, there might be less shrines than there were in Breath of the Wild, but I would happily give up a number of the shrines if it meant getting traditional dungeons back. Some of the shrines are practically mini dungeons in and of themselves, and with the way the Divine Beasts were handled, they were very fun to play around in. They just didn't really last all that long. I'd like underwater content, like swimming around with the Zora armor, and being able to fight underwater. This is in previous Zelda games like Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, and I think it'd be really cool to bring that back. You could use this to give more content to Zora's domain by having more stuff that you could swim around in. You could have dungeon-like areas underwater. That would actually be really cool. And with underwater fighting, this could actually be a place for the Zora weaponry to shine. Like when you're underwater, a lot of weapons would move a little bit slower, but Zora weapons would move at normal speeds, making them ideal for fighting underwater. And I'm going to be perfectly honest, I never really bothered with Zora weaponry. But if they were the best to use underwater, well, then they become no-brainers to use. So keeping along a Zora sword or a Zora spear, if you're going underwater, this would be something that would give Zora weaponry a distinct advantage to use in certain situations. And if there's enough water content in the game, then there'd be plenty of reason to keep a Zor weapon on you. I like the action set pieces going into the Divine Beasts, like, Ruta and Meadow and Naboris. And I'd like more of that. Like, if we get traditional dungeons back, I'd love it if at least some of them had these big action set pieces getting into them. Those sections for the Divine Beasts were a really neat way to mix things up for a bit. Like when you and Sidon are going out and you're trying to get into Ruta and you have to, break all of those ice blocks as they're coming at you and you have to shoot the arrows at Ruta. It's really cool when you have to fly in and shoot bomb arrows in order to get onto Meadow. When you have to ride a sand seal through a sandstorm to get through Naboris. Like, this stuff is really cool. They're pretty short segments that are very heavily focused on the spectacle of it. But considering how much time you're spending running around just in the overworld in Breath of the Wild, having those moments where it's this big, spectacular action sequence are really fun. I'd like for them to bring that back getting into dungeons. And adding on to this, I like the lead-ups to getting into the Divine Beast. And it's not just you go to the place, you do the action set piece, you get into the Divine Beast. There's always a little bit of build-up to it. Like, there's always something for you to do before you get into the Divine Beast. You have the trek up to Zora's domain. You have going through the area collecting the shock arrows. You have to go through and infiltrate the Yiga clan hideout for the Gerudo Town quest line. Like, all this lead up is really cool, and I liked it. It made going into the Divine Beasts more of an adventure because you had all the stuff you had to do before that. The only downside to it is that some of it felt really short. Especially like when you get into the Yiga clan hideout and you're thinking, oh my gosh, we're infiltrating the Yiga clan. You go through a couple of the rooms and then you're like, oh wow, now we're fighting their leader. And then that's it. Like, oh well, that didn't feel like it took too long. I'd like it if we got more expansion on those ideas. Like we're going to set up something that mixes things up. Like the Yiga clan infiltration. That is a stealth mission. You're not supposed to be seen. And then you have actually kind of a fun, if kind of easy boss fight with their leader. Especially if they set this up where you can go to the dungeons in any order, which, if they do bring back more traditional dungeons, I have a very strong feeling they will do that. It's something that's been done in previous Zelda games. Having more build-up and lead into each of them would definitely make it feel a little bit more significant than just walking to one dungeon, then the next, and the next. It would help to give each of these their own contained stories, which is what Breath of the Wild generally did with each of these. They did some good work with this in Breath of the Wild, and I definitely like to see them expand on this in the sequel. I'd like to have a Cave of Ordeals style challenge. Now, we had the Trials of the Sword, which is definitely fun. I really enjoyed that as a challenge, because they strip you of all of your equipment, and you have to go in with nothing, and you have to go up against a bunch of challenges. But I liked the Cave of Ordeals and the way it did it, because the Cave of Ordeals allows you to just bring in whatever. They're just throwing a hell of a lot of crap at you. And I think both styles of challenges can exist side by side, because the Trial of the Sword tests your skills building yourself up all the way through. And the Cave of Ordeals is, sure, you can bring in whatever you want. This just means it's going to be that much harder. Cave of Ordeals is one of my favorite pieces of side content in any Zelda game. I've completed it twice all the way through. I loved prepping myself up going into it, planning out my attack strategy and what I'm going to use. It's so fun. It's similar in spirit, really, to the Trial of the Sword, but it does test things a little bit differently. And considering the fact that you can bring in whatever you have on you, that just means that they can make it that much harder. I just really like the Cave of Ordeals, and I'd love it if there was another challenge similar to that. Now, for the final section, I want to talk about ideas for the story and side quests. First of all, I'd like to see more towns that have been rebuilt, and maybe even towns that we had seen in Breath of the Wild be expanded. Like maybe Hateno Village has more houses and more shops, and there's more buildings there. Maybe some other places have sprouted up. This would be a very good way to show the time since Breath of the Wild that people have since been rebuilding after the defeat of Calamity Ganon. And I'd like it if some of these towns actually needed help, and you had to help them either build up or rebuild. Similar in nature to the Terrytown quest line, which was one of my favorite quests in Breath of the Wild. Having to collect materials for the houses, getting different people from all over the world to help Hudson out, and then slowly but steadily seeing the town go from just being a bunch of rubble to an actual full-on town. It's something that takes a while to go through, especially if you're not just focused on only doing that quest. And it's definitely one of the few side quests in Breath of the Wild that feels like there's a significant progression in it. It's not just you do something, ba ba ba, and then it's done. With Terrytown, you're doing it one step at a time, one building at a time, one person at a time. And it's not just something you can complete in just a couple of minutes. It's going to take you a little while. If they did something similar to that with different towns that you needed to help rebuild, you needed to help them fund stuff, you needed to get them raw materials, then you needed to go get people and to do stuff like that, and maybe each of them would have different specific needs. Maybe certain ones need to work on fortifications against monsters. Maybe some of them just need to build some houses. So you can go to some of these different towns and help them build. And use it as an expansion of the Terrytown quest. And shoot, maybe this could also involve the Bolson construction guys. There's a lot you can do with this, and I think having something similar in nature to the Terrytown quest line, but just expanded, would be really fun. I'd like to have some more notable stories in the side quests. The only side quest that I can remember that had any kind of notable story to it that wasn't tied to the main quest line was the Stolen Heirloom. That quest is built up since very early on in the game when you go and first see Impa, and you have that ancient Sheikah orb, and you see Impa, you see Paya, and you meet the people in Kakariko Village. And you do all of these different side quests in Kakariko Village, and eventually the Stolen Heirloom opens up with, holy crap, the orb has been stolen. And now you're like, okay, now we need to figure out who did it. And you track down different people late at night and see what they're up to, people acting suspicious. You kind of have to do a little bit of investigation. And then you find out that the person who was behind all this crap that was going on was actually one of Impa's guards. And he was selling you out. Holy crap. And you find out the only reason he did any of that was because his children were threatened. You find out that this guy used to be a part of the Yiga clan. And the reason his wife died, which is something you can find out much earlier in the game through just casual conversations with him, is that he left the Yiga clan and they killed his wife for it. So when his children were threatened, he buckled. And then the Yiga clan ended up stealing the orb because of all this kerfuffle. And ultimately, he ends up deciding not to do it. And you go and you fight off the Yiga clan guy he was meeting with. And then you learn about this stuff from him. And it's like, wow, whoa, holy crap. That was so interesting. But it doesn't last very long. It's a relatively short quest. But it left such a big impression on me That, more than any other side quest in Breath of the Wild, stuck out to me as one of the most distinct and notable ones. Now, obviously, most quests aren't going to be like this. Not every quest in the Zelda games is going to be something on the level of the Anju and Cafe quest from Majora's Mask. But I would like to see more stuff that had a bit of a narrative to it, rather than just you doing one thing for a person. The Zelda games have had side quests like this that had a bit of stories to them. I remember that quest in Skyward Sword that could end up with Karain and Pippet ending up dating. Because then you had one of Groos's minions, is that the right word? Who had a crush on Karain, but then she had a crush on Pippet. And ultimately, if you follow this through, then Karain and Pippet are the ones that end up together, and that guy just gets rejected. Sad face for him. But I'd like to have some more quests like that otherwise aren't even really connected to the main plot, but then have their own significant stories just in this little circle of people. Most of the quests, of course, are going to be more simple. But having a few more that were just as notable as the stolen heirloom, I think would go a very long way. Now, I know this may seem a little silly, but I really like trading sequence side quests. Going through and having to trade through a series of items from person to person, and just following through this long quest line, I always really enjoyed those. I enjoyed the Big Goron Sword questline in Ocarina of Time. I like Zenari's flower trading quest in Wind Waker. I just really have a lot of fun with that, and an open world game like Breath of the Wild is perfect for trading sequences. Trading item to item to item and location to location to location, and ultimately ending up with something very useful. I think that would be absolutely amazing in Breath of the Wild, especially if it's something that actually forces you to travel on foot or on horse from one point to the next, because hey, it's a big world that you can actually run around in. It's not something that's segmented like previous Zelda games that would have different big segments, but then loading screens between each area. I'd like to have more meaningful interactions with Purah and Robbie. Purah is introduced really early in Breath of the Wild, and she's very important in terms of the story and the lore. But after you're done getting a couple upgrades for the runes, you're pretty much done talking to Purah. And once you meet Robbie, you talk to him for a little bit, you light the furnace, then you can get some ancient equipment from him. But then that's really it. I'd like it if the sequel gave us some actual more meaningful interactions with them. And it would also be really cool if we got to see some flashbacks involving them and Impa. It'd be really cool if we actually got to see them when they were younger, back 100 years ago. I mean, shoot, and since we have Zelda around, and hopefully she sticks around and doesn't end up trapped someplace for the game, I'd like to see Zelda interacting with Purah and Robbie. She's a researcher herself, and it's left as a bit of a joke in Breath of the Wild, but I think it would actually be really cool if you could help fund Purah's research. If maybe you could drop off money, and it's kind of like, with the Great Fairy Fountains, where it's like, okay, you get a crap ton of rupees, and then you can end up dropping off in increasing increments. And this would maybe unlock stuff. Maybe you can unlock different stuff for runes, or if there's an equivalent power in Breath of the Wild, that you can unlock more stuff with her. And maybe her lab could expand. The more you fund her and the more you help her out, the bigger her lab gets, or the more maybe she builds a new building for research. And it's one of those things where you can actually get a sense of progression through this quest line as you play through the game. And it would definitely give you more reason to go back to Purah than just a couple of times to get some runes upgraded. I'd like more story involving the Yiga clan. They're such an interesting part of Breath of the Wild, being a splinter group from the Sheikah who serve Ganondorf. Holy crap. You see a little bit of them and you run into a lot of their goons. But in terms of the overall story, yeah, they're not really relevant. So I'd like to see more involvement with them. Especially, it'd be really cool if we got to see them serving zombie Ganondorf. I mean, their main involvement in the story in Breath of the Wild is being part of the Gerudo Town quest line. But I'd like to see more of them. I'd like to get more information about their backstory, like more details on how they started the Yiga clan, rather than having them just be a bunch of faceless mooks. I'd like it if we got to infiltrate more bases, like maybe they've set up more bases and maybe they're more elaborate than the one we went through in Breath of the Wild, and you can go through and take them down. It'd be cool if either Master Koga comes back for revenge, or if he's actually just dead down that hole, that someone else has taken over the Yiga clan and they'll want revenge for what you did to Master Koga. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with the Yiga clan in terms of both the story and in terms of gameplay. Adding more of those stealth segments where you go in and infiltrate, and as I mentioned before, maybe even having a Yiga clan outfit that you can use in some of those that help you blend in, and maybe that's how you can actually talk to some of these guys and learn a little bit more about them, rather than having them all just being rah, evil. I'd like something for the Kokiri in this game. Well, the Koronks are in Breath of the Wild. I'd like to see at least some sort of reference to the Kokiri, because we really haven't seen the Kokiri in a while. And maybe they can even touch on the whole idea of how they are able to transform themselves, how they've turned from the Kokiri to the Koroks, and maybe turn back. Like, I'm not saying that I'd want them to just turn into the Kokiri again, just for the sake of fan service. But I'd like some kind of reference to that. Like, there are some of the names on the map that are clear references to Kokiri characters from Ocarina of Time, but like maybe when you're talking to the Koroks, you can learn a little bit more about that. A little bit of lore on the Koroks and the Kokiri is always a good thing. Now, I'd like the story to have some involvement with the Triforce. The Triforce is pretty darn important, and it was pretty much glossed over in Breath of the Wild. And given the fact that we're getting Ganondorf back, albeit in zombie form, and we have Zelda, and we have a Link, I think bringing back the Triforce would be kind of important. And maybe Link could actually properly get the Triforce of Courage in this, and maybe Zelda has to get the Triforce of Wisdom. And maybe Ganondorf either has or is trying to get the Triforce of Power. I mean, the Triforce is a very, very, very important element in terms of the lore of the Zelda games. And while Breath of the Wild has bucked so many traditions, there's some stuff that I feel is kind of core to Zelda, and the Triforce is pretty high up there. So having some involvement with the Triforce in the story, I think would actually be very, very good. I'd like to see more of the Hyrule from 100 years ago, back before the Calamity struck. Now, the most amazing thing that could come from that is being able to play through flashback segments where you actually go and you play through things as they were back then. Like, you could walk around Hyrule Castle as it was, go through Castle Town. You know, that would be really great to see. In Age of Calamity, we actually do get to see more of how things were 100 years ago. We don't really get to walk through the towns or anything, but we do get some glimpses of things back then. I doubt we'll ever get anything to that level, because then that would mean they'd have to create so many of these new areas so that you can play in them. But even if it's just more flashbacks, I'd love to see more flashbacks that sort of flesh things out as they were back then. Learn more about Link's family. Like, we know that Link's father was a knight in Hyrule and Link followed in his footsteps. Like, it'd be cool if we actually got to see Link's dad. It'd be cool if we got to see more of King Hyrule back then. If we got to see more of Zelda back then. More, like I'd mentioned before, more of Pura, Impa, and Robbie as they were back then. And funnily enough, Age of Calamity actually gives us a taste of seeing Pura, Robbie, and Impa from back then. They even give us actual designs for them. And you can even handle this in a similar way to the memories in Breath of the Wild, in that there are certain memories that Link unlocks, and you could easily play this off in terms of the story as, yes, he recovered most of his memories, but he didn't get all of them, and then he recovers more in the sequel to Breath of the Wild. And these could be used to show things of him doing stuff in Castletown with his father, you know, and more stuff with Zelda, and more stuff with the King of Hyrule. Like, yes, it would be absolutely amazing if we could go back in time. I mean, because time travel is something that's been done in several Zelda games. But I don't expect them to create a whole new Hyrule just to show how things were back 100 years ago. It would be amazing, and I would absolutely love it, but I don't expect that. However, I would like more expansion on the time period from 100 years ago, back before everything went down. And it would also be great if we got to see more of the champions. I mean, shoot, more of the champions is good. I mean, more than just them being spirits. I mean, having them stick around as ghosts is cool and all, but actually getting to see them before the calamity struck, because we only got little bits and pieces of them. Even with the added stuff from the Champions Ballad DLC, you know, we still only got snippets of the champions. I'd definitely love it if we got to see more of them. And as a related note, I'd love it if we got to see more of the champions, like ghosts again, and got to interact with them more. I think that would actually be really cool, especially if we have Zelda. And a big thing is, I'd like there to be a proper post-game. Breath of the Wild doesn't have a post-game. Once you beat it, then you're basically just put back right before you get to the final boss. This isn't exactly uncommon with Zelda games, because Zelda games don't really have post-game. But for something like Breath of the Wild, I actually think there is a way to handle having an actual post-game within the context of the story. Especially if this is going to, you know, finish off things for Breath of the Wild. Because Breath of the Wild left a lot of things kind of open. And if we deal with this and we actually defeat Zombie Ganon and you kind of settle things, it'd be cool if after all is said and done, it's like, okay, now you can go back out into Hyrule after the end of the story and still do stuff. Maybe have some quests that you can do that unlock after you beat the game. So you actually have stuff to do after the final boss is defeated that's just extra side content. That's something that I really missed in Breath of the Wild. And I think it really could have worked in Breath of the Wild, especially when you just got Zelda back. It's like, okay, now Zelda and Link are going off to do stuff. It's like, okay, it'd be cool if we actually got to see and play a little bit of that stuff they were doing. It's something that I really think would definitely add to the game. So that was a collection of ideas I had of things that could be in the sequel to Breath of the Wild. All this stuff is just things I think would be cool, and stuff I think would improve the game over Breath of the Wild. There are very few things on this list that I would actually expect in the sequel, but nevertheless, I thought it would be a cool thing to just talk about, and sort of talk about some of the ideas I've had, and some of these ideas I've been thinking about since way back when I first was playing Breath of the Wild for the first time, back when it came out. So what are your thoughts on these ideas, and do you have any ideas of your own? Please comment below, and thank you for watching.